G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the life of the Messiah from a Jewish perspective. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. In this session, we're still in paragraph 145, and we're in the area where preparing the death of the king. The last session, we saw the judgment by the king, and to the disciples, he told them, you know, the true nature of the Pharisees is hypocrisy. They were self-seeking, self-righteous, and they're always looking for some exalted titles. To his judgment to the Pharisees, he pronounced 7 woes on them. One of them was for rejecting Jesus and then leading the nation astray. Outwardly, they look very religious, but inwardly, he says that they're corrupt, they're hypocrites. He lamented over Jerusalem, and he said that the precondition for his return is that the Jewish people must ask him back. We saw him giving his disciples a bit of instruction at the treasury, where they had the 13 large money pots, if you like. The poor widow came, she gave 2 mites, the least she could give, but it happened to be everything that she had. When she threw that in, she was declaring then that she had no one else to trust but God. And then a wealthy guy comes along, and he casts in from his excess. It didn't really hurt him to give anything, no effect on them. And the lesson that Jesus taught his disciples was that true conformity to the Mosaic law must be both external and internal. Then we come into the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, and here we have the prophecies of the King Jesus. Historical setting here is that he's after he's denounced the Pharisees, the scribes and the Pharisees, for leading the nation in rejecting him. He spelled out the precondition for his second coming. The Olivet Discourse was a result of some questions that the disciples had asked him when Jesus told them, as they're walking past the temple. Remember, the boys were saying, the men were saying, have a look at this wonderful temple. And Jesus says, there's going to be a time when there's not one stone left upon another. The temple was going to be destroyed. And it prompted the disciples to ask him 3 questions. And they asked him the questions, and he then gave the characteristics of the church age. And he says, listen, the age that we're now living in is going to be characterized by false messiahs, by local wars. But he says, that's not the sign of the end of the age yet. And the 3 questions that they asked him were, first up, they said, what's the sign of the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the temple? That's the first question. Second question was, what is the sign of your coming, or what is the sign that the second coming is about to occur? And the third question they asked, what is the sign of the end of the age? Now, that was the third question they asked, but that's the first question that Jesus answered. And he said that the sign of the end of the age, the beginning of the end of the age, was that nation was going to rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And that, in the Jewish frame of reference, was a worldwide conflict. And so the first birth pang, if you like, of the end of the age was World War I, World War II. Jesus goes on to say that there's going to be famines and earthquakes. So we are in that period where we have seen World War I, World War II, which is the beginning of the end of this age. So now we come to this continuing on here in these prophecies by Jesus, and we see him talking about the personal experience of the apostles. We find this in Luke chapter 21, verses 12 to 19, and Mark 13, 9 to 13. In this section, Jesus now tells his apostles what they could expect to happen to them. And we should note very carefully here the way that Luke words this. Now, after giving details of what the first sign of the end of the age would be, nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, Luke then wrote that Jesus said in verse 12, but before all these things, that is, before the first sign of the end takes place, before verses 10 to 11 of Luke 21 are fulfilled, certain things should or would happen to the disciples. And in Luke 21 verse 12, Jesus tells them that they shall lay their hands on you and shall persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons, bringing you before kings and governors for my name's sake. It shall turn out unto you for a testimony. So altogether, Jesus pointed out 9 things concerning the personal experience of the disciples. First, they're going to be rejected by the Jewish community. That's verse 12. Second, they're going to be rejection by Gentile governors and kings. Again, that's in verse 12. The third thing we see about them is that both of these persecutions are going to provide opportunities for testifying. And we see that in Luke 21, verse 13. And the fourth thing he says about them is that they need to settle it, therefore, in your hearts. Not to meditate beforehand how to answer, for I will give you a mouth and wisdom. So what he's saying is that when you're brought before these people as part of your persecution, Jesus will give them what to speak by the Holy Spirit. So when they're brought before a court of law to defend their faith, the Holy Spirit will give them the words to say. They don't need to rely on themselves to figure out what to speak, because we see in Luke 21, verses 14 to 15, that's what he's telling them. Now, we cannot use this as an excuse not to prepare for a sermon. This is a specific time, and this is when you're brought before governors, brought before people to defend your faith because you're being persecuted for your faith. Now, the fifth thing we see here is that in spite of the opposition they will encounter, they're going to have success in their testimony. They're not going to be able to be gainsaid or rebutted. And we see that in Luke 21, verse 15. And the sixth thing Jesus tells them is that you shall be delivered up even by parents and brethren and kinsfolk and friends. So Jesus is saying that even their own families are now going to be torn apart, even to the point of their own family members betraying them to death. And we see that in Luke 21, verse 16. And of the 11 apostles, 10 of them will actually die a martyr's death. So that's the apostles' personal experiences. The seventh thing he says is, you shall be hated of all men for my name's sake. So they're going to be hated by the majority of the people for the sake of the gospel. And that's in 21, verse 17 of Luke. The eighth thing is that they shall have spiritual security. And we find that in verse 19. And then ninth, we have that the gospel will be preached in the whole world, beginning with them, his apostles. And we also see that in Colossians 1, verse 6. Now, now we have this one here. Now, this is now going to be a reply to the first question that was raised by the disciples. What is the sign that Jerusalem is about to be destroyed? And we see this in Luke 21, verses 20 to 24. Jesus said, when you see Jerusalem encompassed by armies, then know that her desolation is at hand. Then let them that are in Judea flee unto the mountains. Let them that are in the midst of her depart out. Let them that are in the country not enter therein. For these are day of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. Woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. For there shall be great distress upon the land, and wrath unto this people. They shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So Jesus now answered the first question, what would be the sign that the city was about to be destroyed? And it was, what he said here is that it's by saying here that it was when Jerusalem was surrounded by armies. When they saw this happen, they were to interpret it as the sign. And what were they to do? Get out of the city. Now, only Luke records this. Why? Because if you remember at the very beginning, we spoke about Luke had a very special concern for Jerusalem. And so he writes a lot about Jerusalem. Now, in the year 66 AD, this was when the initial revolt by the Jews against the Romans began. The Roman general of that day, a man by the name of Cestius Gallus, he was actually a legate of Syria from 63 to 65 AD. He moved his forces from Caesarea, he brought them down to Jerusalem, and he surrounded the city. Now, the Hebrew Christians, they took this as the fulfillment of the prophecy of Jesus. And in accordance with his command, they got out of town. If they were in the city, they were to get out. If they were in the countryside, they were not to go into the city. However, had a problem because the Roman army had surrounded the city, so it was impossible to get out. However, a misjudgment by Cestius Gallus provided the opportunity to flee. The General Cestus, he mistakenly assumed that he was facing just a regional uprising around Jerusalem, but he soon discovered it was a widespread grassroots revolt, with Jewish guerrilla forces cutting his supply lines. And as a result, he was now forced to lift the siege and retreat back to Caesarea. So Jerusalem would not be besieged again for another 2 years. So during this lull, where Jerusalem was no longer surrounded, 20,000 Messianic Jews from Jerusalem joined thousands of others from other parts of the country, such as Judea, Galilee, and even the Golan Heights. And they fled to the city of Pella, which is one of the Decapolis cities in the region of Galilee. That was outside the war zone. And this was south of the Sea of Galilee and east, on the east side of the Jordan River. So these Jewish believers survived the judgment predicted by Jesus. Now, Luke described the AD 70 judgment as days of vengeance and as wrath onto this people. And we see that in Luke 21, 22 to 23. The vengeance and the wrath were prophesied judgments for the unpardonable sin. And what happened was that 1,100,000 Jews were killed in the first Jewish revolt, and 97,000 of them were taken into slavery. This AD 70 judgment was begun by General Vespasian and finished by his son Titus. And when Vespasian was called back to Rome to be crowned emperor upon Nero's death, that's when his son Titus took over, Titus Vespasian. Now, Jesus mentions the times of the Gentiles in Luke 21:24. He says, Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So this was an age in which the city of Jerusalem is under the control of Gentile kings or Gentile powers. When did the time of the Gentiles begin? Well, it began with the first destruction of Solomon's temple back in 586 BC. And according to the book of Daniel, it goes from the dethronement of the last Davidic king, who was a man called Zedekiah, to the enthronement of the Messianic Davidic king, Jesus. So that is the times of the Gentiles. It goes from the destruction of the Temple of Solomon back in 586 BC, and it will continue right down until Messiah comes to sit on the throne. 4 Gentile empires will rise and fall during the times of the Gentiles, and the Antichrist, he will be the last ruler, and until his reign is then terminated by the second coming of Messiah. Now, there have been several times throughout history where the Jews broke the dominance of Gentile control over Jerusalem, but these were all short-lived. We had the Maccabean revolt in 165 to 163 BC, to 63 BC. followed by the Jewish revolt against Rome in 67 to 70 AD. Then we had the Simon Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to 135 AD. And then currently where we are today is the 1967 Six-Day War gave Jerusalem back under control to the Jews. But they're going to lose us again in the middle of the tribulation. Now, Jesus now gives some prophecies regarding the Great Tribulation, and we see this broken up into two sections, so the first half and the second half. In the first half, we're looking at Matthew 24, verses 9 to 14, but we find this covered in both in Matthew 24 and Mark 13. So now Jesus is going to deal with the Great Tribulation, and he deals with the first half separately from the second half, and he mentions 5 specific things about the first half. First of all, he says that in Matthew 24, verse 9, there will be persecution of the saints, even unto death. So these are people who are saved after the rapture. So there will be saints in the first half of the tribulation. And many of these saints are going to undergo tremendous persecution. And these are the same as the 5th seal saints, which we find in Revelation chapter 6, verses 9 to 11. Revelation 6, 9 to 11, the 5th seal saints. Second thing Jesus says is that many false prophets shall arise and shall lead many astray. That's in verse 11 of Matthew 24. Third thing he says is that iniquity shall be multiplied. So what that means is that sin will increase because, why? Because the restraint of lawlessness will be removed. And we see that in Matthew 24, verse 12. And a corresponding passage is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 6 to 7. 2 Thess 2, 6 to 7. The fourth thing Jesus prophesied, or he promised, is that those Jews who endure to the end, that's to the end of the tribulation, shall be saved. That's verse 13 of Matthew 24. So now the context here deals with Jews during the tribulation who endure to the end. They will survive physically and will be alive when Jesus returns. They'll also be part of Israel's national salvation, so they'll be saved spiritually. So the main point of this verse is that the Jews who survive to the end of the tribulation will be saved physically and spiritually. In fact, Zechariah chapter 13, Zechariah 13 verses 8 to 9 tells us that 1/3 of the Jews will actually survive the tribulation and come to faith. 1/3 means that 2/3 are killed. Fifth thing Jesus says is that the gospel will be proclaimed throughout the world. This statement is very explicit. And this is verse 14, Matthew 24. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world for a testimony unto all the nations, and then shall the end come. The phrase in the whole world could be taken as a general term, not necessarily including every specific country. However, Jesus went on to say that the gospel will be preached for a testimony unto all the nations. So that means every nation will hear the gospel at that period of time. This is not a prophecy for the church saying that Jesus will return after the church evangelizes the whole world. That's not what this is talking about. The context here focuses on Israel, and the prophecy will be accomplished by the 144,000 Jews who are proclaiming the gospel throughout the whole world. And we find that in Revelation chapter 7, verses 1 to 8. Revelation 7, 1 to 8. Gentiles from every nation, every tribe, and every language group will emerge from the tribulation as believers due to the ministry of the 144,000. And we see the result of their ministry in the second part of Revelation 7, where it's in verses 9 to 17. It says, having washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb. So the gospel is going to go out to all nations, not by the church, but by the 144,000 Jewish evangelists of the book of Revelation. That's the first half. Now we're coming into the second half, and we see this in Matthew 24, verses 15 to 28, and Mark chapter 13, verses 14 to 23. In the second half, we see 8 things. Jesus tells us 8 things here. The second half will begin with the abomination of desolation. In Matthew 24, verse 15, Jesus references the abomination of desolation from Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, and from Daniel 12, verse 11. Now Luke, in writing, let him that reads understand. It means that one should refer to the book of Daniel for full understanding. Daniel chapter 8 speaks of an event fulfilled in 167 BC. This is when the Greek king Antiochus Epiphanes profaned the temple in Jerusalem by setting up an altar to Zeus, and he sacrificed a pig. This became known as the abomination of desolation. This happened about 200 years prior to the conversation that Jesus is now having with his disciples. Daniel chapters 9 and 10 predict an incident that will occur during the tribulation. Now, this is when the Antichrist takes over the Jewish temple in the middle of that 7-year period, and he now seats himself in the Holy of Holies and declares himself to be the one true God. This is according to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 to 4. 2 Thessalonians 2, 3 to 4. Let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. Now, Jesus expected the apostles to know this specific prophecy from the book of Daniel, and that the abomination of desolation will occur exactly in the middle of the tribulation. In Daniel 9:27, it says, and in the midst of the week, in the midst of that 7-year period, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And this is going to signal the breaking of the 7-year covenant between Israel and the Antichrist. The second thing, that's the first thing to occur. The second thing to occur is that the false prophet makes an image of the Antichrist and he sets it up within the Holy of Holies of the Jewish temple. And we see this in Matthew 24:15, but we also see this in Revelation chapter 13, verses 11 to 15. And it says, when therefore you see the abomination of desolation, and it says he is standing in the holy place. The Antichrist is seated. The abomination of desolation is standing in the holy place. From that point to the second coming will be exactly 1260 days. Now, the second thing, as a result of the abomination of desolation, there is to be the flight of Israel from the land. Matthew 24:16 says, then let them that are in Judah flee from onto the mountain. Let them that are in Judah flee onto the mountain. The emphasis here is on extreme urgency. If anyone plowing in the field hears of this event taking place, they must not waste any time to go back to their kibbutzim or living quarters to, pick up their water bottle or a coat. They need to get out of there as quickly as possible. Now, Jesus pointed out 3 difficulties for the Jews if the abomination of desolation occurred at the worst time. First up, it will be difficult for those who are pregnant or have to carry small infants. And Matthew 24, verse 19 tells us that. It's also going to be difficult if it happens in the winter, because in the winter, when the rain falls on the mountain ranges of Israel, water floods a normally dry riverbeds or wadis, and with tremendous force. And what happens there is that the highways in Israel are often covered by water from these overflowing wadis in the rainy season. And the third thing regarding its difficulty, it will be difficult if it happens on the Sabbath. And that's Matthew 24, verse 20. Why? Because on the Sabbath in Israel, public transportation largely comes to a halt from Sunday and Friday until Sunday and Saturday, making it very difficult to travel. So these are three reasons why it will be very difficult at that time if the abomination comes at that particular time and that particular day. The second half of the tribulation is going to be characterized by a worldwide anti-Semitism. For then shall be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, nor ever shall be. And we see this in verse 21 of Matthew 24. It is described as the worst period of persecution that the Jews have ever suffered. However, they'll never suffer anything like this ever again. And there are two passages you can have a look at in Jeremiah chapter 30, verses 4 to 7, Jeremiah 30, 4 to 7, and Daniel 12, 1 speaks about this. Now, under the Antichrist leadership, the whole world will turn against the Jews, and they'll face worldwide persecution. If you look at Revelation chapter 12, verses 6 to 17, it tells us there that once Satan is cast down to the earth and is confined to the earth in the second half of the tribulation, knowing his time is now short, he's only got 3.5 years, he will inaugurate one last effort to try to destroy the Jews once and for all. He knows what the basis for the second coming of Messiah is, and that is that Messiah will not return until the Jews ask him to return. And you can see this in Hosea chapter 5, verse 15 to Hosea 6, verse 3. Hosea 5, 15 to Hosea 6, 3. So if the Jews can be destroyed completely before they ask Jesus the Messiah to return, he will not return, and Satan's career can continue on indefinitely. So the abomination desolation marks the beginning point of Satan's final attempt to destroy the Jews once and for all. So we have a period of intense worldwide anti-Semitism. But Jesus now says that Israel would survive in Matthew 24, verse 22. And except those days had been shortened, no flesh would have been saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Israel will survive this attempt to destroy it, although many will die. As we said, Zechariah says that 2/3 will die. The context of this statement is Jerusalem. It's Jerusalem, Judea, and the Jewish temple. That's what he's talking about in this verse here. In this verse, Jesus refers to the elect nation. This is Israel. This is not believers in general. And the word shortened infers a sense of being cut short, meaning that this time will not be allowed to continue for one second beyond 1,260 days, 3.5 years. The period of Jewish persecution allotted by God will last exactly 3.5 years and then will suddenly be cut short. And the purpose of cutting it short is for the sake of the elect Israel, to ensure that the Jewish people will survive. As I said, Zechariah 13, verses 8 to 9, Zechariah 13, 8 to 9, and chapters 12, 13, and 14 speak of the last battle where 2 out of 3 Jews will die, and then the Lord will come to defend his people at the end of the tribulation. And the fifth thing about this second half, it will also be a time when a rise of false messiahs. including Antichrist. That's verse 23, Matthew 24. Now, Jesus already mentioned back in 24:11 that many false prophets shall arise. However, we see here that there's a difference between the two occurrences here. The false prophets described in the first half of the tribulation give false prophecies. What for? It's to lead people astray. But here in verse 24, it will also be a time of false prophets who will actually be able to perform counterfeit miracles to deceive many. And this we find also in Zechariah 13 verses 2 to 6, Zechariah 13, 2 to 6, and 2 Thessalonians 2, 9 to 12, 2 Thessalonians 2, 9 to 12, and Revelation 13, 11 to 15. Revelation 13, 11 to 15. Now, rumors of the Lord's return will arise, but Jews are to remain in hiding. Now, Jesus said that when the second coming takes place, all men will see it. For as the lightning comes forth from the east and is seen even unto the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man. We see it in verse 27 of Matthew 24. Now, so he's going to come. Everybody will see it. Now, as to the place of the second coming, he gives a cryptic answer. He says, wherever the carcass is, there will the eagles or vultures be gathered together. Now, we saw earlier back in paragraph 123, back in Luke 17:37, the carcass is the remnant of Israel. The vultures are the Gentile armies. And wherever the body of Israel hides during the second half of the tribulation, the Gentile armies will come against them. And there is where the second coming will occur. Now, Matthew tells us that the Jews will flee to the mountains, but he doesn't tell us which mountains. He just says to flee to the mountains. That's in verse 16. Revelation also states that Israel will flee into the wilderness without specifying which wilderness. And we see that in Revelation 12, verse 6 and 13 to 15. Now, according to the Old Testament, that place will be a place called Bozrah. That's the Hebrew, or Petra. That's the Greek. Bozrah or Petra. Presently, this is in southern Jordan. And we see several passages which speak about this. Isaiah chapter 63, 1 to 6 speaks about this. Isaiah 63, 1 to 6. Isaiah 34, 1 to 7. Isaiah 34, 1 to 7. Jeremiah 49, 12 to 14. That's Jeremiah 49, 12 to 14. Habakkuk 3, 3. And Micah chapter 2, verses 12 to 13. And also we see it in Revelation 12, verse 6. Now, I'll just read you Isaiah chapter 63, 1 to 2. This is Isaiah. He's looking to the east from the mountain range. He's looking to the east. And he says, who is this who comes from Edom with garments of glowing colors from Bozrah? This one who is majestic in his apparel, marching in the greatness of his strength. And the answer comes back to him. It is I who speak in righteousness, mighty to save. Why is your apparel red and your garments like the one who treads in the winepress? And that's Isaiah 63, 1 to 2. Now, in Isaiah 34, verses 5 to 6, Isaiah 34, 5 to 6, it now goes on. He says, for my sword is satiated in heaven. Behold, it shall descend for judgment upon Edom and upon the people whom I have devoted to destruction. The sword of the Lord is filled with blood. It is sated with fat, with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For the Lord has a sacrifice in Bozrah and a great slaughter in the land of Edom. So that's where Isaiah, when he saw the one coming from the east, he was coming from Bozrah. And why was he coming from Bozrah? Because he had a great sacrifice there, a great slaughter. And this was the slaughter of the Gentile armies who had come against the Jews in hiding in Bozrah or Petra. Now, we now come to the second coming itself, in Matthew 24, 29 to 30, also in Mark 13, 24 to 26, and Luke 21, 25 to 27. Now here Jesus answered the second question. What would be the sign that the second coming was about to take place? And he says four things here. First of all, he says, there's going to be a total blackout so that no light will penetrate from the sun, moon, or stars. And we see this in Matthew 24, verse 29. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven. So Jesus said clearly what will happen. This will happen right after the tribulation. So this is at the end of the 1260 days of Jewish persecution. You can find it in Zechariah 14, 5 to 7. Zechariah 14, 5 to 7. It's there on the slide. Second thing, there will be perplexity upon the earth. We look at this in Luke 21, 25 to 26. Upon the earth, distress of nations in perplexity for the roaring of the sea and the billows. Men fainting for fear and for the expectation for the things which are coming on the world. For the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. So we'll see colossal tidal waves of all tsunamis of all kinds will rock the globe, resulting in anarchy and confusion. And throughout the world, mankind will tremble over the events that will occur at that point in time. And then third thing, Jesus gave the sign for the second coming. Then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. That's verse 30 of Matthew 24. What that sign will be is the Shekinah glory light. There will be, remember, it's pitch dark, it's pitch blackness, no light from sun, moon, or stars. And suddenly, this blackness will be dispersed by the Shekinah glory light. It will come descending down from heaven. And this light is going to be visible throughout the whole world. So everybody in the world will see the sign of the second coming. Back in Matthew 16, verse 27, we read back there, for the Son of Man shall come in the glory of his Father with his angels. So this is, and what we see here is that throughout, though Jesus will return to one particular spot on earth, which is the city of Bozrah or Petra, the Shekinah glory light itself will be seen right throughout the entire world. Now, with the sign of the second coming itself, we will see the Son of Man himself coming in the clouds of heaven. So the answer to the second question is, what is the sign of the second coming? Is that the earth will be enveloped by blackness, by darkness, and suddenly this darkness is dispersed by the light of the Shekinah glory. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And that's the second part of verse 30 of Matthew 24. The mention of tribes here, then all the tribes of the earth, the mention of tribes would suggest this is speaking of the 12 tribes of Israel, obviously saved, because here we have the second coming, which was the result of a regenerated Israel calling for his return. And the mourning of these tribes is the same as that of what we find in Zechariah 12:10 to 13:1. Zechariah 12:10 to 13:1. Now we see the regathering of Israel, and we find this in Matthew 24:31 and Mark 13, verse 27. It's covered by one verse in each of the Gospels of both Matthew and Mark. And Jesus now summarized most of what the Old Testament says. And these are passages like Isaiah 11, 11 to 12, 6, and Jeremiah 23, 5 to 8, Ezekiel 11, 16 to 21. So he's just going to summarize what all the prophets were saying. So what we see is that after the second coming, there'll be the worldwide regathering of the Jews. And since the details of this are well known from the Old Testament, Jesus didn't bother to go into any great depth of telling his disciples. He merely pinpointed that this regathering would happen following the second coming. In Matthew 24, verse 31, it says, he shall send forth his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. The background to this is in Isaiah chapter 27, verse 12 to 13. Isaiah 27, 12 to 13, where he prophesied there about the final regathering of the Jewish people. And then in Mark 13, verse 27, his one verse summary is, and then shall he send forth the angels and shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from the uttermost part of the earth to the uttermost part of heaven. Now, the background to this is found in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 4, where in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 4, it says that if any of your outcasts be in the uttermost parts of heaven, from thence will Jehovah your God gather you, and from thence will he fetch you. Now, both Matthew and Mark speak of regathering from two localities, from the four corners of the earth and from the four corners of heaven. From the four corners of the earth, well, if it's on the earth, this would be the living remnant of the Jews who survived the tribulation. From the four corners of heaven, this would be the Old Testament saints, men such as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to whom God said, to you as well as to your seed, I will give this land. And that was God's promise back to them in Genesis 35, 9 to 15. That's Genesis 35, 9 to 15. So these are resurrected and then regathered from the four corners of heaven. So what we see here is that the living and resurrected Israel will enjoy the Messianic kingdom together. Now we see some exhortations. We find these in Luke 21, verse 28. And these are the exhortations of Jesus. But when these things, Luke 21, 28, but when these things begin to come to pass, look up, lift up your heads, because your redemption draws nigh. Now, Luke records Jesus's words here, that when we see these things, we're to feel elated. Now, what things is he talking about? In Luke's gospel, the context of this verse goes back to verse 20. Verse 20 of Luke. Goes back to verse 20 of Luke 21. But when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies, when you see Jerusalem surrounded with armies, AD 46 and 4 years later, we find that Jerusalem was destroyed. So this was when they saw Jerusalem surrounded by armies. AD 46 and then AD 70, it was destroyed. Luke specified that when they see these things happen, when they see Jerusalem destroyed, which is the beginning of these things, which we find in Luke 21, verse 20 to 27, Luke 21, 20 to 27, they should look up, for their redemption draws near. That's Luke 21, verse 28. Once Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70 and the judgment for the unpardonable sin finally fell, every prophecy that must precede the rapture of the church was fulfilled. Since AD 70, the rapture has been imminent. It can happen at any time. From the destruction of the temple to now, it could happen at any time. And since the teaching of Scripture is that the rapture must precede the tribulation by an unknown amount of time, we don't know how long, no signs are given for the rapture, there are signs for the tribulation. So the closer we get to the tribulation, that much closer we are to the rapture. And since we've already seen the first sign of the end of this age, which is World War I, World War II, we should be looking forward to the time of the rapture. Why? For our redemption is drawing near. Now, Jesus gives a parable of the fig tree. And we see this in Matthew 24, 32 to 35, Mark 13, 28 to 32, and Luke 21, 29 to 33. And the point of this parable is quite often misused by prophetic and those who are into sensational writing, and they use this to try and date set for the rapture or the second coming. Now, Jesus clearly states in Matthew 24, verse 33, and Mark 13, 29, and Luke 21, 31, that no one will ever know the day or the hour of the rapture. In Matthew 24, verse 32, we read here, "From the fig tree learn her parable. When her branches now become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is nigh. Even so you also, when you see all these things, know that he is nigh, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away until all these things be accomplished." Now, most of us over the decades would have read some of these books, so we have we can understand how they have taken these verses, and their logic is something like this. What some people say is that the fig tree mentioned here, it's Israel. It's a symbol for Israel. Therefore, what this verse is saying is that when Israel becomes a state, the generation alive at that time will still be around when Messiah returns. And so a generation is labeled as being 40 years. So if Israel became a state in 1948, that means that the second coming must be no later than 1988. And since the rapture is to happen at least 7 years before that, the rapture cannot come any later than 1981. Now, there are books written like that. So this passage has been used as a date-setting passage. Well, we're in 2021, almost 40 years past, is it? Yep, 1988. So, you know, this parable is not teaching anything about date setting or a date setting for the second coming of Jesus. There are several things that are misused here. There's nowhere in the Bible that we're told that a generation is limited to 40 years. In fact, there's only one place in all of the Bible where a generation is given any period of time, and there it's 100 years. And the passage is down in Genesis 15, 13 to 16. In Genesis 15, 13 to 16, God was speaking to Abraham, and he said, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and ill-treated for 400 years. In the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here." So that makes a generation 100 years. Now, essentially in the Bible, the term generation has quite a few variations. Sometimes it's 80 years, sometimes 40 years, sometimes only 20 years. And in this passage, generation is not used as a time element, but rather Jesus was using it to refer to a group of contemporaries, you know, like my generation today, in the way, you know, that's how we would use it today. Now, a second mistake is to make this fig tree a symbol of Israel. Now, Jesus was not using a symbol that way. Rather, he's using the fig tree literally as an illustration. And this comes out clearly if we look at the Luke account in Luke 21, which everybody seems to want to ignore. According to Luke 21, verse 29, we read that he spake to them a parable. Behold, the fig tree and all trees. So if the fig tree is Israel, what are all these other trees? Do they represent other nations? And if they do, at what point does one start to count the 40 years? There are scriptures which do use the fig tree or figs as symbolic of Israel. We find it in Hosea chapter 9, verse 10, for instance, and also Jeremiah 24, verses 1 to 10. But what Luke clearly shows us here is that the fig tree is not used as a symbol for Israel. It is used literally to serve as a simple illustration. The illustration is this. When you see the fig tree and all the trees beginning to blossom and bud, we know, hey, spring's come and summer is not far away. My apricot tree's got blossoms and buds in it now. That's the point of the illustration. Nowhere in the context is the reestablishment of Israel referred to. It's not here at all. Jesus was presupposing that Israel would already be a state. And that we can see that from earlier in this section. Nowhere is the reestablishment even considered worthy of mention. What then did Jesus mean when he said in Luke 21:31-33, even so, when you see these things coming to pass, know that the kingdom of God is nigh. Amen. I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away till all things be accomplished. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. So in Matthew 24:33, when you see all these things, Matthew 24:33 refers back to the abomination of desolation back in 24:15. So what Jesus is saying is that when you see the abomination of desolation, then you can know that he is near, even at the doors, because we know that from when they see the abomination of desolation until the second coming is exactly 3.5 years, 1,260 days. Remember, a Jewish month is 30 days. And then in Matthew 24:34, we read there that Jesus said, this generation shall not pass away till all these things be accomplished. Now, what he is saying here is that the Jewish generation that will see the abomination of desolation in the middle of the tribulation will still be living when he returns 3.5 years later. The purpose of verse 34 of Matthew 24 is to serve as a word of comfort. The abomination of desolation in the middle of the tribulation signals Satan's final attempt to destroy the Jews once and for all. But Jesus said that the Jewish generation which would see the abomination of desolation would also be alive when he returns. So the point here is that Satan's program of Jewish destruction will be doomed to failure. It will not succeed. And then the section ends with, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. And what he's doing here is that he's emphasizing the fact that every prophecy that Jesus gave in this discourse will be fulfilled. What has not yet been fulfilled will certainly be fulfilled in the future. To sum up, when you see the fig tree and other trees coming into leaf, you know that summer is coming. So when you see the abomination of desolation, you know that Jesus himself will soon return. The generation involved with the abomination of desolation will still be alive when the Messiah returns. So Satan's program of Jewish destruction is doomed to failure. Now we got the rapture. We see the rapture. We see this in Matthew 24:36-42 and Luke 21:34-36. Now we have a new topic here. In this section, Jesus deals with the rapture of the church. In the Matthew account in verse 36, immediately after the promise about this generation not passing away, we get the word but, B-U-T, but. And the construction in Greek which is used here is what is called peride, P-E-R-I-D-E. This construction means that the speaker is moving to something in contrast to what has gone before. It's a different topic. In other words, what he's doing is he's saying that he's introducing a new topic here, quite different from the one he has been talking about. The previous context was about the second coming of the Messiah. By the use of this grammatical construction, we know that what now follows is no longer about that. No longer about the second coming. It's a new subject. And the new subject is the rapture of the church. Concerning this, Jesus said 3 things. As to the question of when this event will occur, Matthew 24:36. But of that day and hour knows no one, not even the angels of heaven, neither the Son, but the Father only. So we know exactly when the second coming is to take place. We know that. It comes 7 years after the signing of the 7-year covenant. It comes exactly 3.5 years, 1,260 days after the abomination of desolation. In fact, it is specific to the day. We're told in Revelation and in Daniel that the second coming will take place exactly 1,260 days after the abomination of desolation. But as far as the rapture is concerned, the only clue we have is that it will occur sometime before the tribulation. It could be 30 years, it could be 40 years, or it could be just before. Nobody knows. What we're told clearly here is that the angels do not know the date of the rapture, and that the Son of Man in his humanity did not know the date of the rapture. The text makes it clear that there is no room for any kind of date setting here regarding the rapture. We're given clues as to the type of circumstances, but nothing at all to help with date setting. No one knows but God the Father. Jesus said it would happen when there are normal conditions on the earth. For as in those days which were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark. And they knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall the coming of the Son of Man. These are all normal conditions on the earth when the rapture will come. So when people ask the question, is it bad enough yet for the rapture? They misunderstand the scriptures. The rapture will come when there are normal conditions on the earth. And this is certainly not true of the second coming. We've been given the circumstances which would precede the second coming, and conditions will be anything but normal. So we must take that periday, that but of verse 36 seriously. There's a very sharp contrast between the second coming and the rapture. Now in Matthew 24, 40 to 41, it's going to be a separation of, it's going to be a snatching away of believers from their unbelieving companions. Then shall two men be in the field, one is taken, one is left. Two women shall be grinding at the mill, one is taken, one is left. Took away in verse 39 is for judgment. Taken away here is to take along or to receive one to oneself. Back in 39, it was in the days of the flood. They were taken away in the flood for judgment. Here, they're taken away in the rapture to be with Jesus. Now, there's an urge to watch for the tribulation so as to escape it by means of salvation. But this comes out in Luke 21:36. Watch at every season, making supplications that you may prevail to escape all these things that should come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man. The tribulation judgments of all these things described in Matthew 24, 9 to 28 will fall upon all who dwell on the earth. However, the way to escape those judgments is by being watchful, meaning having salvation. This is another clear teaching of a pre-tribulation rapture. We are to watch so that we can escape all these things. What does this mean? What does it mean to be standing before the Son of Man? The Son, Jesus, is going to rapture us. We will meet him in the air, and then we shall be standing before him and escaping all the things which are going to fall upon the earth. And some rapture passages you can have a look at is 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 13 to 18, 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 to 18, 1 Thessalonians 1, 9 to 10, 1 Thess 1, 9 to 10, 1 Thess 5, 1 to 10, 1 Thessalonians 5, 1 to 10, 1 John 14, 1 to 3, sorry, John 14, 1 to 3, not 1 John, John 14, 1 to 3, 1 Corinthians 15, 50 to 58, 1 Corinthians 15, 50 to 58, and then Luke 21, 34 to 37, and Revelation chapter 3, verse 10, Revelation 3, verse 10. So what we're going to see is that watching and being ready is going to be synonymous with salvation in the next sessions. Thank you for coming along. There are contact details there for you.